What happens when a billionaire who commands headlines every day cannot find the courage to speak the words that matter most? And what happens when the woman who keeps his world turning discovers she, too, is more than an assistant, more than a shadow, more than silence? This is the story of Ethan Caldwell, a man whose empire is built on order, and Grace Whitmore, a woman whose strength is measured in quiet details, coffee laced with cinnamon, schedules smooth before they break, a daughter's love for a mother who forgets more each day. For years, they walk side by side, bound by discipline, separated by fear. But one evening, beneath the glow of a chandelier, Ethan sees Grace through another man's eyes, and everything he thought he controlled begins to unravel. Will courage arrive too late? Or will they learn that love kept in shadows is no love at all? What does it cost to step into daylight with the truth? Stay with us as we unfold. The billionaire never confessed his feelings to his assistant until he saw her with another man. If this story touches you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. A woman who keeps a powerful man's world turning wonders why being indispensable can still feel invisible. A man who has mastered every headline cannot name the ache that rises when he sees her smile at someone else. The city woke in layers that morning. First came the sound of buses sighing along Madison Avenue, then the rising hum of coffee carts and impatient horns. By the time the first shaft of pale light struck the high glass towers, Grace Whitmore had already crossed the Hudson, walked through the marble lobby of Caldwell Media Group, and stepped into the elevator that carried her to the 59th floor. Her shoes made almost no sound against the thick carpet. She liked it that way. The office before dawn was a place she understood better than anywhere else empty, hushed, waiting for order. She slipped her coat across the back of her chair, checked the day's agenda one more time, and carried a steaming cup into the corner office before its occupant arrived. The coffee was black, strong, with a quiet pinch of cinnamon. She always added it at the end, a ritual so practiced it no longer required thought. Ethan Caldwell never asked for cinnamon. He never mentioned it, yet he drank every drop. Grace had no idea whether he noticed, but she hoped he did. Ethan arrived at precisely 7:30. The sound of his shoes was different, measured, deliberate, announcing authority without trying. His tie was already straight, his jaw freshly shaved, his expression unreadable. He greeted her with the same nod he used for producers, editors, even senators who came to court his empire. Grace answered with a calm smile and stepped aside. The day unfolded the way all his days did. Board calls at 8, a briefing with attorneys at 9, an acquisition review at 10. His life was a calendar of edges, and he lived inside it with the discipline of a widower who had trained himself to trust order over chance. He trusted walls more than people, schedules more than sentiment. Grace read those schedules the way others might read scripture. She knew the weight of footsteps in the hallway, the meaning of a sigh when an elevator door opened late. She kept the newsroom's frantic pulse from crossing the threshold of his office. Where others saw an intimidating billionaire, she saw a man who carried silence around him like armor, and she carried some of the weight so he would not have to. By noon, the light shifted. A stripe of gold cut across the avenue below, reminding her she had a quick errand to run. She promised herself it would take 5 minutes. She slipped into the street, pulled her scarf tighter, and headed toward the pharmacy near Bryant Park. A voice stopped her before she reached the corner. Grace. She turned. Michael Hart stood there, tall in his white coat. Though his tie was loose, his expression relaxed. She knew him from her mother's clinic visits. He had the kind of presence that made hard moments softer. For months he had asked after her mother's progress with a patience that never felt like duty. They exchanged a few words, laughter rising naturally in the brisk air. Michael reached into his pocket and drew out an envelope, white and heavy with embossed edges. His hand rested on hers for a heartbeat as he offered it. "Come to the Heartline Gala," he said. His tone was kind, inviting, as if he had waited for the right moment to ask. Grace hesitated, but she took the envelope. The seal bore an engraved heart in deep red. She felt warmth crawl across her face, uncertain if it was flattery, curiosity, or fear of remembering she was more than a calendar and a caretaker. High above them, behind floor-to-ceiling glass, Ethan had paused between meetings. His aides waited outside while he reviewed notes for the next call. Something drew his gaze downward. He spotted her at once. Grace. She was laughing, not politely, not carefully, but with the kind of ease he had never allowed himself to imagine. The sight pierced through his control. Then he noticed Michael's hand resting briefly on hers, and the flash of the envelope with its red seal. The world he trusted edges, walls. Order shifted beneath him. A fracture opened inside his ribs. He told himself it was about optics. He told himself an assistant in the papers, photographed at a gala on another man's arm, might send the wrong message during a sensitive merger. That was the story he repeated in his mind as his jaw locked. But he knew it was not true. It was not about optics. It was not about business. It was about Grace. He closed the blinds with a single motion, startling his assistant outside the door. He sat back at his desk, pulse steady on the surface but storming underneath. His hand drifted to the lower right drawer, the one with the brass keyhole. He unlocked it slowly, as if he feared being caught. Inside lay a small stack of envelopes, thick paper, fountain pen ink, words written late at night when silence became too heavy. Letters never mailed, notes never shared, every one of them addressed to her. He touched the top envelope but did not open it. He slid the drawer shut again, turned the key, and placed it in his pocket. The meeting resumed. His voice carried its usual calm authority. Each syllable measured, each pause strategic. No one noticed the difference, but the taste of cinnamon lingered at the back of his throat, sharp and sweet, and he could not decide if it comforted him or burned. By night, the city softens. Behind two different doors, two disciplined lives keep their shape, and yet both reach for the same quiet mercy. Ethan Caldwell's penthouse overlooked Central Park West, its windows set high enough to mute the horns and chatter below. From the outside, it looked like a fortress of glass and stone. Inside, it felt like order frozen in place. The kitchen gleamed, every counter clear, stainless steel without fingerprints, a single mug drying on the rack. The treadmill in the corner whirred at a steady rhythm, matching his breath. He ran until the tightness in his chest eased into muscle fatigue, then pressed stop. The silence that followed felt heavier than the run itself. On the sideboard near the west-facing window sat a frame that never moved, his wedding photo. The light caught it late in the afternoon, touching the faces caught in a happiness that belonged to another lifetime. He had kept it there not for memory, but for discipline. It was a guardrail, a reminder of promises broken by fate, not choice, a reason not to stray. That night he tried to read acquisition memos, draft contracts, legal analysis. Words he had mastered long ago blurred into repetition. He found himself rereading the same page, hearing only the quiet that stretched across his apartment. It was a silence without melody, as if something essential had been cut from the score. He set the papers aside and closed his eyes. For a moment, he almost wished for noise, someone humming off-key, footsteps that weren't his own, the low murmur of another presence. Almost across the river, in Hoboken, Grace Whitmore was ending her day with different rituals. Her apartment was smaller, warmer, marked by the kind of clutter that came from caregiving. Pill organizers lined the counter, each marked with letters for the days of the week. Her mother's neurology appointments filled the calendar pinned near the fridge, circles and notes in her neat handwriting. In the living room, her mother sat beneath a knitted blanket, knees thin under the fabric, eyes bright with recognition that sometimes slipped away without warning. Grace tucked the blanket more snugly, smiling when her mother told a story from years ago, this time remembering every detail. Grace let herself bask in it. A few minutes of clarity felt like a rare gift, too precious to rush. When her mother drifted towards sleep, Grace stepped onto the narrow balcony. The skyline rose across the river, a jagged crown of lights against the night. She leaned against the railing, untying the knots of the day with each exhale. From here, she could almost believe the city belonged to her, not just to those who moved it from behind tinted glass. Her thoughts circled back to the white envelope resting in her bag. Heavy cardstock, edges pressed, a seal embossed with a heart. Michael Hart's voice had been gentle, but his invitation carried weight. It was possibility, standing open in her hands. And possibility frightened her more than exhaustion. Exhaustion she knew. Possibility she had learned to fear. She closed her eyes, hearing again her own laugh in the street that morning. It startled her. How easily it had come. She wondered if Ethan had noticed. She wondered why she cared. The night deepened. Ethan's treadmill stood silent. Grace's balcony cooled under the autumn breeze. 2 apartments, different in scale, echoed with the same absence. Both lives disciplined, both lives shaped by duty. Both hungry for something neither dared name. Morning came with its choreography. Ethan woke before 6, his alarm unnecessary. He shaved, tied his tie, and left without breakfast, coffee waiting at the office as always. The elevator mirrored his reflection back at him, controlled, polished, unreadable. Grace woke to the rustle of her mother's blanket, set out medication, stirred oatmeal with cinnamon the way her mother liked it, then caught the 7:15 train. She timed the doors, the escalators, the elevators at Caldwell Media Group like a practiced dance. No step wasted. By the time Ethan entered his office, she had already set the coffee 3 inches from his right hand. The cinnamon rose in the steam. He didn't mention it. She didn't ask. Their partnership worked because it asked for nothing beyond competence, because it stayed within lines neither of them crossed. And yet, both felt the edges shifting, though neither admitted it. That night, back in Hoboken, Grace placed the white envelope on her dresser. She opened her jewelry box and laid her grandmother's simple silver bracelet beside it. The bracelet had been her anchor for years, a reminder of the quiet strength she came from. She looked at the 2 objects together, as if waiting for the past to tell her how to step into the future. The city pulsed on outside her window. She lay down, but sleep did not come easily. Some weeks dressed themselves as routine. Under the fabric, a live wire hums. Monday began with the usual crackle of breaking news. A senior anchor had lost her voice minutes before airtime, and the newsroom scrambled for a substitute. Grace managed the calls, shifted the scripts, and by the time the red light went on, the audience never knew a crisis had unfolded. Ethan stood at the back of the studio, arms folded, calm to anyone watching. Only Grace noticed the faint release of tension in his shoulders when the segment ended without a flaw. Tuesday brought a negotiation that refused to move forward. Lawyers crowded his office. Papers spread across the table like a map without roads. Grace listened quietly, noting which points made Ethan's jaw tighten and which made his pen tap against the legal pad. She slipped him a document from a lower folder, one clause overlooked by the others. It turned the conversation. The lawyers left with the beginnings of an agreement. Ethan said nothing, but his eyes met hers for a second longer than habit allowed. Wednesday tested them differently. A travel plan fell apart when a connecting flight was canceled in Chicago. Producers panicked, afraid the keynote Ethan was scheduled to deliver in Los Angeles would be lost. Grace's fingers moved across the keyboard with speed and precision, pulling up alternate flights, rerouting car service, and shifting a meeting by half an hour. By the time Ethan walked toward the airport, his itinerary was whole again. He didn't ask how. He never did. Yet, in the black car, he found himself staring at the neatly printed schedule, tracing the margin where her pen had curved his initials. Thursday stretched long, meetings spilled past dusk, and by the time the last executive left, the office was dim except for the glow of streetlights through tall glass. Grace brought cartons of Chinese takeout into the conference room. Steam fogged the windows as they ate in companionable silence. Their hands reached for napkins at the same time, fingertips brushing before pulling back with disciplined grace. Neither spoke of it, both felt it. Later that evening, a sudden rainstorm caught them leaving through the side entrance. The awning shielded them only halfway. They stood close, but not touching, rain spilling inches away. Ethan's driver pulled up, the black car shining wet under the streetlight. The door opened. They entered, shoulders careful, leaving a polite inch of air between them. Still, both felt the warmth that no storm could drown. Friday carried the quiet hum of anticipation. The city's rhythm sharpened toward the weekend. Emails about the Heartline Gala floated through inboxes, elegant invitations written in formal fonts. Grace opened hers at her desk. The digital seal matched the paper one resting on her dresser at home. She hesitated, cursor hovering, then clicked yes. She owed herself one night where she was not a human calendar, not only a daughter caring for a mother, not just an assistant keeping a billionaire's empire aligned. One night to be simply Grace. That afternoon, Ethan sat with a draft of his keynote speech. His pen marked the margins with swift notes until it reached a line about integrity. He pressed harder, carving a groove into the paper. The word glared back at him. He stopped writing, staring at the inked letters as if they carried a choice he had not made. He could not decide which frightened him more, breaking a rule or wanting to. The week, dressed as ordinary, had already betrayed itself. Routine had collapsed into recognition. The gala became more than a social event. It became a test neither admitted aloud. As Friday night closed, rain returned, tapping against glass on both sides of the river. In Ethan's penthouse, the treadmill sat unused, the silence louder than any machine. In Grace's apartment, the white envelope still lay on her dresser beside her grandmother's bracelet. Both tried to sleep. Both failed. Two apartments, pretending to be comfortable, holding two hearts that knew the truth, waiting just beyond Saturday. When a caregiver says yes to a single evening, it is never just about a dress. It is about remembering she has a life that fits no clipboard. The clinic smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee brewed hours ago. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a thin wash of white. The air carried the soft squeak of rubber soles against polished linoleum. Every patient wore the same paper gown, a fabric that leveled differences, making professors and construction workers, widows and teenagers, look equally fragile. Grace sat with her mother in the waiting room, her hand resting lightly on her mother's arm. The older woman's eyes wandered from posters about stroke awareness to the nurses moving with quiet efficiency. Grace whispered reassurances, though she knew her mother would forget them by evening. Michael Hart appeared at the doorway, his coat unbuttoned, his tie slightly loose as if he had been running from one wing to another. His presence carried a steadiness that asked for nothing in return. He greeted Grace's mother by name, lowering his tone with respect, then offered updates with patience. His kindness was the kind that did not need witness, though Grace noticed it and stored it like warmth against a cold day. When the appointment ended, Michael walked Grace to the lobby. They paused near a vending machine where the hum filled the silence. He pulled an invitation card from his pocket. "The Heartline Gala," he explained, his voice careful, not pressing. "It funds cardiac care for families like mine. My father died of a heart attack too soon. This is how I try to make sure fewer daughters know that loss." Grace held the card, its embossed lettering catching the artificial light. She had imagined a glittering evening of gowns and cameras, but in his voice she heard service, not spectacle. She imagined rows of chairs, stories shared, money raised that might help someone like her mother. The thought eased something in her chest. She nodded, more to herself than to him. Back at the Caldwell building, the office carried its usual hum of urgency. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, voices rose in small arguments over headlines. Grace moved through it with quiet precision. But as she passed a half-closed conference room, words floated out: black dress, hem length, 7 o'clock arrival, a logistics call, harmless to anyone else. But to Ethan Caldwell, standing in the hall, the words tilted the ground beneath him. He paused, his face unreadable, then turned back toward his office. He told himself it was nothing, yet the sound followed him like a thread pulling tight. Inside his office, he seized control the way he always did, by tightening schedules, adding notes to calendars, adjusting deadlines by minutes that others would not notice. He told himself it was leadership, that details were his armor. But even as he worked, a voice inside whispered the truth. It was not leadership. It was fear. Grace finished her day later than usual, the city already cooling into night. At home, she placed the card on her dresser beside her grandmother's bracelet, the silver catching lamplight. She opened her laptop, searched for dresses, and chose one without hesitation. Black, simple. The kind of elegance that would not shout. It was modest enough to walk in, strong enough to remind her that she was more than schedules and pill organizers. She entered her payment details and clicked confirm. The following week, a brown carton arrived at her Hoboken apartment. She carried it into her bedroom, the cardboard rough against her fingers. She set it on the bed and slit the tape with a kitchen knife. Inside, the fabric folded neatly, dark and smooth, waiting to be claimed. Grace lifted it gently, spreading it across the quilt as though it might slip away if she wasn't careful. The dress looked like a page from another book, one she wasn't sure she had the right to read. She traced the neckline with her hand, a quiet promise hidden in the seams. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it, uncertain if she deserved the life it represented. Her mother's soft breathing drifted from the next room, reminding her of the world she carried every day. Grace exhaled, long and slow. The gala was not about the dress, she told herself. It was about remembering that she had a self beyond duty, a self that had been waiting patiently. Jealousy rarely slams doors. It pulls threads until the seams complain. Friday morning arrived with the same careful rhythm as every other day. Yet the air inside Caldwell Media Group felt different. Grace Whitmore walked through the halls with her shoulders a touch higher, her steps a shade lighter. She carried her usual poise, but underneath it ran a quiet pride, the kind she no longer bothered to apologize for. The black dress waited at home in its box, and even though no one in the office knew, it changed the way she carried herself. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. His emails that day were clipped, clean, stripped of the small acknowledgments he sometimes allowed himself to add. No soft thank you tucked between directives, no glance that lingered past necessity. His tone tightened like a belt, pulled one notch too far. At 11, he sent a message about her weekend schedule. It contained a single line. Be careful with networking men at industry events. Optics matter. Grace read it twice, her lips pressing into a line. She recognized the pattern instantly: concern disguised as policy. Protectiveness written in corporate language. She closed the email, unwilling to reply, unwilling to let irritation spill into words that might later be regretted. By noon, she confirmed her RSVP for the Heartline Gala. She pressed the button without hesitation, though her pulse ticked faster afterward. It was a promise to herself as much as a response to an invitation. She would attend. She would walk in on her own terms. Ethan, at the other end of the building, opened his calendar and added a late strategy review for Friday night. The meeting sat there like a wall he could hide behind. Hours later, he canceled it with no explanation. The cancellation notice reached Grace's inbox at 6:30. She stared at it for a moment, then shut her laptop. As night drew down, Margaret Lane moved quietly through the halls, finishing her own work. She was a woman who had spent decades inside corporate towers, learning to read silences as carefully as memos. She noticed the way air shifted when Ethan and Grace passed each other. A pause that was almost too long, a glance cut short. She filed the observation in the cabinet she labeled human, the one she kept apart from profit and loss charts. She did not meddle. She simply knew. The building emptied, and the city filled with its usual Friday night pulse. Taxis lined curbs, laughter spilled from bars. The sidewalks glittered with umbrellas under the evening drizzle. In his penthouse, Ethan tried to unwind the static. He changed into running shoes, set the treadmill to a brisk pace, and ran until sweat slicked his skin. The machine hummed, his heart pounded, and still the restlessness stayed. He showered, poured a single glass of scotch, and sat in the chair by the window. Central Park stretched below, dark and silent, but his thoughts refused stillness. He replayed the image of Michael's hand on Grace's days ago, the gleam of that embossed invitation, the way her shoulders seemed lighter today. He told himself he had no right to feel this way. He told himself a dozen stories about discipline and optics. None of them worked. Across the river, Grace folded laundry in her Hoboken apartment. She placed fresh sheets on her mother's bed, tucking the corners with practiced care. She measured out evening medication, kissed her mother's forehead, and watched her drift into sleep. Only then did Grace allow herself to return to her own room. The dress still lay across the quilt, its fabric dark and smooth. She touched it lightly, then pulled her grandmother's bracelet from the jewelry box. She slid it onto her wrist, testing the feel, grounding herself in memory. She tried to drain the static by tidying the kitchen, by writing a grocery list, by sitting on the balcony with tea. But the city lights only reminded her of what waited tomorrow. 2 apartments, 2 bedtime routines, 2 people trying to quiet the storm in different ways. Neither succeeded. Ethan lay awake, the glow of his phone screen casting shadows across the photo of his late wife. He turned it face down and closed his eyes, though sleep did not come. Grace lay awake, the dress still near, the bracelet still cool on her wrist. She stared at the ceiling until the numbers on her clock blurred. Jealousy had not slammed a door. It had pulled threads. And by Saturday morning, both lives would feel the seams complaining. Under chandeliers, the heart has nowhere to hide. Music tells the truth that language delays. Lincoln Center glowed against the night, its wide glass panes catching the city's reflection like a crown of light. Marble steps stretched upward, polished to a soft sheen by decades of careful shoes. Inside, the gala stirred with movement, the low rustle of gowns, the muted shine of cufflinks, the murmur of voices pitched for donation pledges. Grace Whitmore stepped into the grand hall with Michael Hart at her side. Her black dress fell clean and simple, without ornament, yet on her it looked like courage. She had chosen restraint over spectacle, and the choice suited her. A silver bracelet, worn smooth by years, glimmered against her wrist. Michael offered his arm with courtesy, but no claim. He was present, attentive, measured, never possessive. Grace felt grateful for that. Ethan Caldwell arrived minutes later, a donor badge clipped to his lapel, his posture precise. He told himself he came for optics, that being seen here mattered for the narrative of integrity surrounding his acquisition. He walked among senators, philanthropists, and CEOs, exchanging nods and polite phrases. Yet, even in this crowded room, solitude pressed in like a shadow only he could feel. The marble mirrored back his stature, but also his isolation. Across the crowd, his eyes found her. It startled him, though he had known she would be here. Grace stood among strangers with ease he had never allowed himself. She leaned in as others spoke, listening fully, offering the kind of attention that felt like a gift. In that moment, Ethan saw her not as the efficient presence who filled his mornings with order, but as a woman alive in her own right, luminous under chandeliers. Awe arrived first, sharp and undeniable. Pain followed, heavier, rooted in the knowledge of what he had denied both her and himself. The evening unfolded in movements like a symphony. Strings began softly, then swelled as the dance floor cleared. Couples moved toward the center. A waltz filled the space, graceful and slow, carrying an old-world elegance into a modern room. Michael extended a hand to Grace. She accepted, her dress sweeping lightly as they stepped into rhythm. Their movement was practiced kindness, not possession, her hand resting gently in his. Her steps matched without effort. They moved not as lovers, but as 2 people who knew how to respect presence. Ethan stood near the edge of the room, a glass of champagne in his hand. He did not drink. He watched. His grip tightened around the stem as gravity pressed harder than the polished floor beneath his feet. He could not name the force, but he could feel it pulling him in directions he refused to admit. The chandeliers threw their light across faces, across the swirl of black and jewel-colored gowns. Music lifted and carried every hidden ache into motion. Ethan's face betrayed nothing, but inside, restraint fractured. He could not watch her laugh softly at something Michael said without feeling the sting of years wasted in silence. He could not see the way she turned her head with grace and not imagine what it might be like if she turned it toward him. Nearby, a photographer moved silently, harvesting images with quick flashes. His lens captured Grace's dress sweeping across the marble, Michael's hand steady at her back, Ethan's gaze fixed and unreadable. Later. Those photographs would be edited, framed in headlines that implied more than they showed. Tonight. They were just evidence of what the eye could not speak aloud. The music ended, applause rose and faded, conversations resumed, laughter spilling in brief bursts, waiters weaving through with trays of sparkling glasses. Grace excused herself for a moment, stepping toward a quieter corner. Ethan shifted as if to follow, but stopped. His feet refused what his heart demanded. He remained still, glass untouched, eyes fixed on a point just beyond her. For Grace, the evening felt like standing at the edge of two worlds. She admired Michael's steadiness, the way his kindness asked for nothing but gave much. She also felt the pull of something larger, more dangerous, written in silence across the room. She tried to steady her breath, unsure if the strength she carried all day could hold through the night. The gala wound down with speeches, with pledges, with the careful exchange of promises between those who built empires and those who funded causes. Ethan shook hands with donors, delivered words with practiced conviction, smiled for cameras. Yet inside, the confession had already happened, though no sound had been spoken. His restraint had cracked where no lens could see. When the final toast ended and coats were retrieved, the crowd spilled back into the night. The city's air met them with sharp coolness. Grace inhaled, the taste of marble and music still clinging to her senses. Ethan stepped into his black car, the door closing with a soft thud. Michael offered Grace his coat for the walk to her own ride. Street air afterward tasted like metal, thin and bracing. Everyone went home. No one rested. Distance does not always announce itself. Sometimes it changes the temperature by a single degree and waits. Monday came with rain-washed streets and the gray fatigue of a city returning to routine. Ethan Caldwell stayed home. His office staff received a single email early that morning, working remotely for focus. No explanation, no further words. From his penthouse, he sent instructions stripped of their usual small courtesies. Memos came without acknowledgement, directives without softening phrases, his calls, when he allowed them, trimmed down to function alone. Grace answered each one in the same calm tone she always used, but inside she noticed the subtraction. Where once there had been a trace of warmth, now there was nothing but glass. Tuesday followed the same script. Grace moved through the newsroom with flawless precision, her presence efficient as breath. Papers appeared on desks before anyone realized they were missing. Calls were routed, schedules adjusted, fires extinguished before they caught flame. She became an efficient ghost, always there, making everything easier, yet receiving nothing in return. Not a glance, not a word beyond necessity. The silence pressed in, colder than scolding would have been. That night, Michael Hart's name lit her phone screen. His text was simple dinner, sometime this week. No pressure. The words landed like a life raft tossed across dark water. She stared at the glow for a long moment before typing, yes. The reply floated back with steady kindness. She felt relief, but also distance, as if the raft carried her, but drifted away from the shore she truly longed for. Wednesday stretched long. Meetings filled the day, but Ethan's absence was a louder presence than his participation had been. Grace filed reports, updated travel plans, and crossed tasks off her list with mechanical accuracy. By evening, her shoulders ached, but her mind spun faster still. Silence, she realized, was not a condition, it was a choice. And knowing that hurt more than she wanted to admit. Late in the afternoon, Margaret Lane appeared at Grace's desk with a folder. She set it down gently, her expression lined with decades of observation. Margaret had worked long enough to know how to read the spaces between people. She glanced once toward Ethan's office door, closed and quiet. Then back at Grace. "You're good at making things disappear," Margaret said softly. "Just don't let yourself be one of them." Her voice carried no judgment, only the weight of someone who had seen careers and lives fold under invisibility. Grace nodded, throat tight, grateful for the reminder, even as she tucked it away for later reflection. Outside the building that evening, a newspaper stand carried a tabloid headline. A photograph from the Heartline Gala filled half the page. Grace in her black dress, Michael beside her, Ethan visible in the blurred background. The caption speculated about new relationships and old tensions. It brushed the edges of truth while missing the heart of it entirely. Passers-by glanced, shrugged, and kept walking. For those who lived inside the frame, the damage was subtler but sharper. Thursday dawned with a sharp wind and restless skies. Grace returned to her desk early, as always, her hands moving with automatic steadiness. Ethan continued his distance, sending another string of clipped emails, his words efficient to the point of cold. The office hummed around her, but she felt alone inside it, as though the glass walls had sealed her away from warmth. By evening, the building emptied. One by one, lights clicked off, voices faded, footsteps receded. Grace's desk lamp remained the last glow on the floor. She stacked papers, closed files, and glanced once more toward Ethan's closed office. Nothing stirred inside. Outside, rain began again, tapping against the tall windows. The city blurred under streaks of water, neon smearing across wet pavement. Grace sat still for a moment, listening to the sound, spine straight, eyes dry. The silence had become a decision. And with that recognition, something in her spine hardened. She shut off her lamp. The floor surrendered to shadow. The truest conversations often happen when nobody plans them, and the building is almost empty. The Caldwell Tower stood against the night like a glass ship at harbor, its upper floors still glowing while most of the city wound down. On the 59th floor, the hum of daytime had drained away, leaving only the soft swish of custodial carts rolling down carpeted halls. Somewhere below, the city flickered with headlights and neon, glowing like a low-fire ocean. Grace Whitmore's lamp was one of the few still burning. She sat at her desk, jaw tight with focus, fingers moving across files that could have waited until morning. She told herself she stayed for efficiency, but the truth was harder. Work was safer than stillness. Work filled the spaces silence had carved open in the last week. The elevator chimed, doors slid open. Ethan Caldwell stepped out. He carried no briefcase, only his phone and a sharp tension in his shoulders. "Forgot files," he muttered when the custodian looked up. It wasn't true. The files could have been scanned, sent, retrieved in seconds. But tonight, he needed a reason to stand on this floor. He saw her immediately, head bent toward the glow of her lamp, hair falling forward as she read. The sight pressed against him like a weight, both welcome and unbearable. She looked up. Surprise flickered across her face, then steadied into neutrality. "Late night," she said softly. "Needed something," he answered, though the words sounded thin. The air between them was different. It carried years of loyalty, countless days of unspoken partnership, but also the raw mark of a week spent avoiding each other. The silence stretched until it demanded breaking. Grace set her pen down. Her voice was quiet but firm. "This distance, it costs something. Pretending it doesn't only makes it heavier." Ethan's hand curled around the edge of a chair. He felt the truth in her words. He had hidden behind policy, behind optics, behind the armor of professionalism. But hiding had not kept him safe. It had only hollowed the space between them. Fear had been his shield, but fear had also built the wall that kept him alone. He drew a breath, let it out, and sat across from her. "I thought silence would protect us," he said. The words landed heavy, not dramatic, only plain. It hasn't. For a moment, neither moved. The city lights pulsed behind them, a slow heartbeat against glass. Then Ethan stood, crossed to his office, and unlocked the drawer he had touched but never opened in her presence. The key clicked softly. The drawer slid open. Inside lay a stack of envelopes, thick paper edged in dust, each sealed but never sent. He lifted the top one, turned it over in his hand, then set it down on the desk between them. He did not open it. He did not read it. He let its existence stand, years of unsaid words pressed into ink, folded into pages, waiting but never delivered. Grace's eyes rested on the envelope, then lifted to his. She saw in his face what the paper confirmed the feelings had been there all along, not invented by jealousy, not born of impulse. They had been written and hidden, season after season. Her breath caught, but she did not reach for the envelope. She did not need to. The proof was enough. The weight of it changed everything. Silence settled again, but this time it was not avoidance. It was recognition. At last, Grace spoke. "We can't decide this in shadows. Not like this." Ethan nodded. Daylight. He agreed. Care, not impulse. They said nothing more. The decision was not a conclusion, but a beginning. The question had shifted from whether to how. The custodial cart rolled past once more, its wheels whispering across carpet. Time urged them on. Together, they walked toward the elevators. Their steps echoed in the hollowed quiet of the floor. At the doors, they paused, separate buttons lit by separate hands. When the elevators arrived, they stepped into different cars. The doors closed almost in unison. Both felt their hearts beating as if the building itself could hear. Sometimes the heart's exam is not multiple choice. It is a single blank line that asks for courage. The Italian restaurant in the village was small, tucked between a bookstore and an aging tailor shop. Brick walls carried the memory of decades, warm in the glow of candlelight. Tables sat close enough for voices to mingle, yet each one seemed to hold its own small world. Grace Whitmore arrived early. She chose a corner table where the candles flickered against a bottle of Chianti, repurposed as a holder. Her black coat rested on the back of her chair, her silver bracelet catching the light when she reached for the menu. Michael Hart entered with the unhurried step of someone who carried no urgency in his presence. He greeted her with a smile that asked nothing, then sat across from her. Their conversation began easily, weaving between stories of patience, his nonprofit's work, and the small details of her week. The food arrived: fresh pasta with basil, bread still warm, olive oil shimmering in the candlelight, the soft clatter of plates and the low hum of surrounding voices wrapped around them. Grace felt something rare, the lift of being seen as a woman, not only as an assistant or a caregiver. Michael's attention was steady, his eyes never wandering, his words thoughtful without calculation. For a while, she let herself rest inside it. She laughed at his dry humor, nodded at his reflections, and even allowed the glass of red wine to warm her cheeks. It felt good, this reminder that she was more than schedules and obligations. Yet, even as she smiled, her mind drifted. It returned to a locked drawer uptown, filled with envelopes written in careful ink. It returned to the moment Ethan had let her see what he had hidden for years. Not by words, but by evidence too heavy to ignore. Her heart tilted back toward those pages, toward the taste of cinnamon she could almost summon without lifting a cup. She forced herself back into the present, but the contrast only sharpened. The warmth she felt here was real, yet it was not the fire that lived behind her ribs. Michael noticed. He read the weather of her silence as if he had long practiced the skill. He set down his fork, leaned back, and gave her a small smile that carried both kindness and truth. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly, his tone free of accusation. "All I hope is that you choose the life that feels like oxygen, not obligation." Grace felt her throat tighten. Gratitude swelled inside her, not because of what he offered, but because of what he released. He had given her permission to admit what she already knew. They finished the meal with gentleness. Conversation drifted back to safer ground, to light stories, to quiet laughter. When they stood to leave, Michael helped her into her coat without lingering, his touch respectful and brief. Outside, the night was cool, the pavement slick from a late drizzle, streetlights reflected in shallow puddles, catching fragments of neon and headlights. Grace stood there for a long moment, breathing like someone about to start running. The city's air felt sharper, cleaner, as if her lungs had been waiting for this decision. Michael raised a hand in parting. "Take care, Grace." His voice carried no regret, only goodwill. He turned toward the subway, leaving her with silence that felt like space, not absence. Grace looked down at her phone. Her hands shook slightly as she typed. 3 words, a pause, then 5 more. "Are you home? I need to see you tonight." She pressed send before she could reconsider. The message flew through the night, across the river, toward a penthouse where light still glowed against the dark. Love that hides in the dark behaves like smoke. Love that chooses the light behaves like a vow. The door to Ethan Caldwell's penthouse opened with a quiet click. Grace stepped inside, her coat damp from mist, her pulse still fast from the courage it had taken to press send. The apartment looked as it always did, impeccable, restrained, but tonight the lamp softened its edges. Their glow turned steel into warmth, glass into invitation. Central Park stretched below the windows, its trees breathing in darkness, exhaling faint waves of city hush. For once, the silence felt less like judgment and more like permission. Ethan stood near the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He turned when she entered, and for a heartbeat they only looked at each other. All the clipped emails, all the cold calls, all the years of unspoken weight stood between them. Grace set her bag down, her hands steady though her chest was not. "We can't keep circling," she said softly. He nodded, his voice, when it came, carried no ornament. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of breaking rules, afraid of losing what we built, afraid of what the world would make of us. And in that fear, I hid behind silence." Grace let the words settle. They matched what she had suspected, but hearing them out loud cracked something open. "Silence doesn't protect," she replied. "It only erases." They moved to the couch, not close, not far. The air carried the tension of confession, but also the relief of truth stepping out of shadows. Ethan spoke again, slower. "There's more. The imbalance between us. My position, your role. It isn't fair to you. I've let that justify distance, but distance hasn't made it right. It's only made it worse." Grace folded her hands in her lap, then unfolded them. "If we move forward, it cannot be hidden. My work matters, my dignity matters. That means transparency, no whispers, no secrets, clean reporting lines, shared accountability. If we choose this, we choose daylight." The word daylight lingered in the room like a vow. Ethan exhaled, as though letting go of armor he had worn too long. "Then daylight it is," he said. For the first time in years, control was not his reflex. Courage was, and courage felt like surrender, but not defeat. It felt like choosing truth over the safety of silence. They sat together, the city humming faintly beyond the glass. No grand gesture followed, no sweeping romance played out under fireworks. Instead, tenderness revealed itself in smaller acts. A blanket folded neatly over the arm of the couch was pulled across Grace's knees. Her shoulders, tense for days, loosened when Ethan placed it there without flourish. His hand hovered, then rested beside hers. She let her fingers touch his, and together they stayed until both hands forgot their own tension. On the kitchen counter, a small tin of cinnamon waited, always tucked away before tonight. Ethan set it openly beside the coffee canister, no longer pretending he hadn't noticed all these years. The gesture was quiet, but it said what the unsent letters had tried to carry. "I saw you. I see you still." The night deepened, words thinned. They stood side by side at the wide window, the city below turning from scattered neon to a wash of steady light. Central Park stretched like a shadowed ocean, and beyond it, Manhattan gleamed with sleepless brilliance. They did not know what tomorrow's headlines might hold. They did not know what the board or the press or the world would say, but they knew what they had chosen. Not shadows, not silence, not smoke. They had chosen light. The clock neared morning. They remained at the glass, watching the city become less night, more dawn. Scandal is loud. Integrity is patient. Only one survives the week. The room where it began again was not grand. No chandeliers, no marble, no stage. Just a bright conference room on the 59th floor. Blinds drawn open on purpose so daylight would be part of the record. A long table stretched between them, polished but plain. Margaret Lane sat at one end, her reading glasses low on her nose, the weight of decades in her calm presence. Across from her, the head of HR adjusted her papers with the precision of someone who believed in procedure more than performance. Grace and Ethan sat side by side, but not too close, as if both understood the difference between partnership and presentation. The disclosures were read aloud, signed, dated. Ethan recused himself formally from all compensation decisions tied to Grace. Reporting lines were redrawn, placing her under Margaret's supervision. Protocols were documented, not whispered. Every line said the same thing in different words we will not hide. It could have felt clinical. Instead, it felt like breath returning after weeks of holding lungs too tight. Later that morning, a board subcommittee convened. Packets were handed around the table. Each contained a record of Grace's years at Caldwell Media Group. Not love letters, not special pleading, just a history of competence written in schedules kept, crises averted, negotiations steadied, margins filled not with excuses, but with proof. The packet read like merit, not like defense. Some board members nodded as they turned the pages. One even smiled, faint but genuine. The story inside those pages was not of scandal, but of someone who had long deserved more than the title assistant. Outside the walls of decision, noise buzzed, a tabloid headline spiked, a blurred gala photo dressed in captions that reached further than truth. But the company's statement landed within hours, measured, transparent, refusing to fan fire. We acknowledge, we have safeguards. We stand by both the integrity of our people and the clarity of our process. No adjectives, no drama, just daylight. Advertisers exhaled, investors stopped dialing emergency numbers. Staff in the newsroom, who had braced themselves for spectacle, read the statement and then returned to work. One producer muttered, "If only all stories were told that clean." Another just nodded. Grace carried the weight differently than Ethan. For him, it was about reputation preserved. For her, it was about dignity restored. Midweek, she took the train to Hoboken with a small tin of cinnamon in her bag. Her mother was having a lucid afternoon. They sat together at the kitchen table, steam rising from mugs of tea. Grace opened the tin, letting the fragrance lift into the air. Her mother closed her eyes, inhaled, and smiled. "You're brave," she said simply, voice thin but sure. Grace felt her throat tighten. Of all the words that had been spoken in boardrooms and conference halls, none struck deeper than those two. Back in Manhattan, Ethan walked again through the office he had avoided. For the first time in weeks, he felt the floor lighter beneath his feet. Staff greeted him without hesitation. Margaret's nod carried respect, not worry. Grace's desk, now formally hers under new lines, glowed with the steady order she had always brought. Only now, nothing had to be hidden in shadows. The crescendo of risk had passed, and what remained was not fire, but a study in clarity. Public pressure had not broken them. It had given them the chance to show another way to handle love, not as scandal, but as human truth managed with human care. By Friday, the week had worn its edges down. The newsroom hummed, cameras clicked, phones rang, but laughter rose from the break room. Ordinary laughter, colleagues leaning on counters, sipping coffee, telling small jokes that had nothing to do with headlines. Ethan paused in the hallway, listening. Grace joined him, a file in her hand, and for a brief second their eyes met. The sound of ordinary joy washed over them both. After a week of storms, ordinary sounded holy. 2 years later, the reward for risking the right thing is not a throne. It is a table large enough for work and love to sit down together. Late summer carried a softer light in Vermont. The hills rose green, and the fields ripened with corn and hay. On the edge of a dirt road, a white farmhouse stood, its porch wide, its windows open to the hum of crickets. Once, it had sheltered generations of farmers. Now, it sheltered stories. Inside, laptops glowed across a long wooden table. A chalkboard listed deadlines in colored chalk, dates for shoots, names of communities scattered across rural New England. This was Caldwell Stories and Social Impact. The division Grace Whitmore had founded, built on the belief that health and caregiving deserved the same spotlight as power and profit. Staff moved through the house with purpose camera bags packed, audio gear checked, grant drafts spread across desks. Their voices blended with the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. The place hummed, not like an office tower, but like a living home. Margaret Lane, now CEO of Caldwell Media Group, visited once a month. She walked the halls with the same steadiness she had carried in Manhattan, offering feedback with a wry smile. Ethan Caldwell had shifted into his new role as executive chair, no longer the daily authority, but still the compass. He came north often, bringing both wisdom and willingness to let others lead. Grace led her team with quiet strength, drawing from the same skills she once used to manage schedules at Dawn. Only now the scope had grown wider. Instead of board packets, she guided documentaries that captured the grit of rural nurses, the tenderness of family caregivers, the unseen heroism of ordinary days. On Sunday morning, the farmhouse slowed. Grace and Ethan sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, cinnamon rising warm in the steam. A laptop balanced between them played the rough cut of a new film, a story about a community clinic keeping its doors open against impossible odds. Grace took notes in a neat hand, Ethan adding thoughts in the margin, their collaboration unforced, companionable. When the cut ended, they closed the screen and stepped down the dirt road, their shoes brushing gravel. The fields stretched wide, the air smelled of hay. The to-do list waited back at the table, but for this hour, they let the world be simple. Later, Ethan's adult daughter joined a planning call from Boston, her voice carrying through the farmhouse kitchen. She spoke with energy about a new investigative project, asking questions that blended journalism with conscience. Grace listened, smiling at how seamlessly family had folded into mission. Once, Ethan might have resisted such blending, fearing that lines blurred would mean order lost. Now, he understood it as steadiness, the kind of grounding he had never known he needed. That afternoon, Grace sealed a large envelope. Inside was a grant proposal, pages that spoke of the work her team had done and the dreams they carried next. She walked it to the farmhouse mailbox and slid it in with both hands. The motion was small, yet her chest filled with the same quiet pride she had once felt placing office supplies neatly at dawn on the 59th floor. Different scale, same heart. As the sun dipped, the farmhouse glowed golden. Staff lingered on the porch steps, trading stories of travel and community. A pot of soup simmered in the kitchen. The empire had not shrunk to make room for love. Love had broadened the definition of empire. When dusk gathered, a single porch light clicked on. Its glow stretched across the yard, steady and warm. Grace leaned against the railing, Ethan at her side, the crickets singing their evening hymn. What they had built kept asking for courage, and they kept saying yes. What this story reminds us is that silence is rarely protection. It is often just postponement. Ethan believed his discipline could keep him safe, and Grace believed her usefulness was enough. Yet both discovered that the cost of hiding truth is heavier than the risk of speaking it. For those of us who have lived through decades of duty and restraint, it is easy to let roles define us: parent, worker, caregiver, provider. But the heart does not age in the same way. It keeps asking the same questions it did in youth. Am I seen? Am I valued not for what I do, but for who I am? Courage is not always a grand gesture. Sometimes it is a quiet decision to be transparent, to claim dignity, to step into the light even when comfort begs us to stay in the dark. This story shows that love, handled with honesty, does not diminish the life we've built. It deepens it. It adds room for joy beside responsibility, for companionship beside work, for tenderness beside order. Perhaps the lesson is simple. It is never too late to choose daylight. And when we do, we find that courage builds a larger life than fear ever could. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in a small way, we would be so grateful if you clicked like, shared it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories of courage, love, and hope, stories that remind us all that it is never too late to choose the light.